your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my fabulous co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
Pro tip that has nothing to do with anything. I found out today that the Aldi knockoff Oreos are better than actual Oreos.
You can't be correct about that. That's a physical impossibility.
It is true. No, it's true. The cookies taste exactly the same, and the filling... I got the double stuff, and it's more stuffing than the double stuff Oreos, and it's creamier filling.
Okay,
so if you have an Aldi nearby, go and test these out and prove me right.
So if you're listening to the show, go out and do this, and direct your hate mail to aristillman4@gmail.com.
There's probably just one caveat here, because vegans would like to know. That would be me.
Oh, that's a good call.
Oh, yeah.
Is the new and improved?
Maybe that's why they're creamier. Maybe they might have some milk type product in there. I'm not sure, but if you're vegan, you don't deserve to have nice things. That's my definite opinion that I have.
But yeah,
it's an easy joke to make.
I was just gonna say, Ari, you are debunked because those Oreos are probably more cruel than regular Oreos, and undoubtedly not as good tasting. So you lose completely.
The sadness. Yes. You were tasting.
Well, anyone remotely interested in or involved in the atheist or skeptic community will remember recently a paper, that damn paper that was released recently called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. And I mean, just reading that title, I think the hair on the back of anyone's neck is going to stand up on that one, because you just know what's coming, right? And the motives of the authors are well-known quote-unquote skeptics, Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, and basically they're trying to make a mockery of gender studies by writing a nonsense paper and get it published in a respectable journal. And there's like 5 million things wrong with that entire situation, and it's been debunked thoroughly and brilliantly in articles I will be happy to link in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But it does bring up the question for me, what even is gender studies? I'm going to be honest and say that before this whole thing, I had a pretty limited understanding of what gender studies is outside of the obvious implications of what it's called. I saw it as just, this academic discipline that's very esoteric and not super relevant to real life. And I have since learned otherwise, and I'm glad I'm being let out of my ignorance on that. So that's the conversation that we want to have this week. What sort of practical things have come from this field of study? What is gender studies? Why should it matter to people outside of academia? And our guests for this discussion this week are Genevieve Derrick, who has an honors degree in gender studies from the University of Sydney, a Bachelor of Education, and has presented at conferences and lectured in all kinds of colleges across the world. Welcome, Genevieve.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And Christina Harrison has a BA in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Miami University in Ohio, an MA from the University of Cincinnati in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and is entering her third and final year at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Welcome to the show, Christina.
Thank you for having me as well.
So I figured we would get some folks on who have some credentials to educate us in our ignorance, myself included, because I am not an academic type. I'm not one of those kinds of people who's like, oh, college academics, that's all silly. No, I just never went to college, so it's not my thing. So I'm here to be educated. So let's talk for a quick second about exactly what gender studies is, because I feel like this as a basic concept is probably not well understood by a lot of people, even people who would be sympathetic. So either one of you, whoever wants to take it, let's just talk for a second about what gender studies even is.
I'll let Genevieve start with that one. Go ahead.
Ooh, lucky me. I think one of the things about gender studies is that there are a whole bunch of ways that we're identified in the world, I guess. And gender is one of them. And it constructs the kinds of opportunities that we have, the kind of experiences we have, the ways that we can think about the history of the world, about our futures, about the way we can approach just about anything. And things are just amazingly cross-applicable, I've discovered. So, for instance, I read an article by Iris Marion Young, who's an amazing feminist scholar, called The Logic of Masculine as Protectionism, which is this incredible piece which applies amazingly to a bunch of stuff around foreign policy and international relations, about how much the ideas that are used in perpetuating domestic violence, which very many people on the ground in social work and stuff with feminist backgrounds see again and again, in fact, the idea of creating this sort of supposedly safe home space that includes, not being able to engage with external factors, includes increasing, escalating violence potentially inside the home, as long as you construct people on the outside as being worse, as being more threatening, as being somehow more terrifying, is, for instance, an amazing way of engaging with the idea of fascism, right? And the way that we construct nation states today, and we think about, if you can make the external other more terrifying, then you can get away with all kinds of things in domestic policy. And so feminist theory has pointed out some really great ways of rethinking that and thinking about the ways to sort of engage and intervene with those kinds of things. Just to name one thing.
Christina, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you're pointing to, Genevieve, is something that is absolutely incredible about gender studies, and that it really is applicable to anything. I mean, I'm talking from, I think I mentioned in conversation with you folks earlier, from neuroscience and how the brain works and how hormones may impact that, for example. Or, of course, when we're looking at trans identities and what these kinds of things can mean, and when we're seeking, health care for trans identities, knowing that kind of gender focus is very critical. But it also extends to when we look at history and art and how women, female bodies or assigned female at birth have been looked at and seen as sex objects, for example, through art. I mean, it really is. I was asked, it's kind of funny, in my master's oral exam, they asked me the question. Now, here I am trying to get a women's gender and sexuality studies master's degree, and they asked me, is women's gender and sexuality studies an academic field? And I'm sitting there thinking, I sure hope so. I've spent 2 years of my life, 4 years before this, studying it. And I think what they were really pointing at is they wanted me to point out the importance. And one of the things that I thought is the most important is that gender studies is one of the only disciplines that is willing to actually critique itself. Okay, so we're willing to look at ourselves and go, that's not right. I mean, because I can look at things that were written in the 90s by, what people would consider third wave feminist scholars and disagree with a lot of it because it's transphobic, or there's a lot of other issues. And that's where I think a lot of people misunderstand, is that we're not sitting in a room, singing Kumbaya, burning bras. It's actually a much
Damn it,
broader...
I was hoping that was what you were doing.
Although that does sound like a good time. Come on, let's be honest.
I mean, it gets repetitive.
Right.
It does, exactly. And so I was never in on that anyway, but so the point is that it's a much deeper, broader field, and can be applied in any way. So
yeah, I think that's a great counterpoint to what I mean, I feel like it's an obvious straw man of gender studies, right? Because I feel like that's the image that is projected by people who are so-called skeptics when it comes to gender studies, right? They paint this very easy caricature of this person who is like, if you tell a woman no ever, you're a misogynist and you might as well be murdering women, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of the straw man that's drawn, right? And it's really not like that. I mean, even just in the little bits of research that I've done, I mean, this is really deep, nuanced stuff that is oftentimes very self-critical.
I think one of the important things too is that so back from many, many, many years ago, when sort of philosophy started, the kinds of binaries that started up, that the world has kept going for many, many years, are the kinds of things that feminist and gender theory really critiques, along with a lot of ethnicity studies, American studies kind of approaches. But, the kind of split between mind and body, for instance, is something that feminist theory, that gender theory has really engaged with. And I think it's incredibly important, because if we keep those binaries in place, we can't actually properly engage with all kinds of things, from medicine through to just like basic social interactions. People inhabit their bodies and are determined by those things. You can't effectively engage with, for instance, talking about, the healthcare crisis issue at the moment without really thinking about how, the idea of bodies is a very different thing from the very matter and weight of bodies. And feminist theory gender studies is something that's really engaged with that over the years.
I feel like it may be kind of an extension of the argument of, we have to call these things out because they exist, whereas the other side often sees it as, when we start talking about these things, that's where we're creating these divisions, as opposed to simply naming divisions that already exist. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I've really stepped into the label feminist killjoy recently. Because for me, it's a reminder, the idea of the killjoy, and there's an amazing scholar, Sarah Ahmed, who's done some great work around this. But the idea of the killjoy is the person who, comes in, is taking draining all the fun out of life, right? But the fact is that, like, so many of these people are coming in, if I'm approaching something from a gender studies perspective, I'm not inventing issues. I'm pointing out pre-existing issues that are creating biases and creating structural difficulties for entry for all kinds of people. They already exist. They're already making the lives of many people suck, and pointing them out isn't making it worse. It's trying to make things better.
And I also want to point out, too, I think that another misnomer is that it only affects people that are female-bodied or assigned female at birth, and that's not true. I mean, we're talking about something that affects cisgender males just as much. When you look at somebody who wants to take, for example, family leave and use the Family Leave Act and the stereotypes that are associated with that because they're a cisgender male who's seeking to take care of their family. So these are stereotypes, and these are gendered issues that play out and affect everybody across the board, regardless of your gender or no gender.
Well, right, because you start talking about that, and I think of the idea that a lot of men are shamed for getting vasectomies because that's a much easier and less expensive process than a hysterectomy or having your tubes tied or anything like that. And that's like, in so many situations, that's the obvious thing to do if we're talking about a monogamous cis hetero couple. Like, that's the thing that makes sense to do. But there's this social stigma, right? And that puts pressure on men as well. So I think that's probably another misnomer, is that it's all man hating and all that kind of stuff. And it's it's so silly because I don't know anyone who speaks about these issues in a serious way that doesn't also acknowledge, like, no, like, the problem is misogyny, but you don't necessarily have to be a woman to be a victim of misogyny. Obviously, obviously women bear the overwhelming brunt of it, but any cishet guy who steps outside of these roles is punished severely for doing so. I mean, even if you just like wearing pink shirts or something silly like that,
even hair or
Well, even within the LGBTQ community, I mean, I had a colleague who their entire thesis project was on Grindr and these apps and how they would post, no femmes, no fats, exactly. Yeah. And, these kind of stereotypes that are they're overflowing even into the gay community as well. So it's really not, it's a problem. Gender affects every single one of us. It's the first question that you ask, whether you have a baby or even when you get a dog, right?
And it actually feels like it's actually one of the smartest things as far as as far as a PR campaign that the anti-gender studies lobby managed was to somehow make gender studies just the bastion of where bitter women are supposed to reside. Because, I mean, honestly...
Well, there's some of us here.
Well, I was going to say, honestly, the best arguments for misandry I've ever heard have been from rather hateful men. So... but it's a sales tactic. It's not reality. The fact is that gender is something that everyone is affected by. Gender policing happens to everybody. It's not just the kind of thing that happens to women. It's not just the kind of thing that happens to the trans community. There are so many variations. I mean, just the fact that, for instance, it took gender studies professors to connect with the medical community and have a conversation about what is genuinely happening in the development of gender, like of sexual expressions and how we classify them. And it turns out that if you follow all of the different kinds of protein releases and different kinds of things that can go wrong or right in the development of fetus, technically there are 26 different gender expressions.
Wow, I did not know that. And so that knowledge was brought to us by somebody asking a question related to gender studies, right? It wasn't
exactly.
It wasn't what people generally think of as this just sort of clinical hard science, right? Although obviously that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that like medicine is a construct. It is a thing, like we take our preconceptions and we put them on bodies. We interpret them and we understand them. So necessarily our idea of what makes female sex or male sex is something that we've necessarily constructed as the field of medicine is constructed. You can't just kind of say, oh, well, there must be these two things because there's no arbitrary proof. Someone at some point designated that, somehow that might be connected to particular chromosomes, but like though, XXY exists, XYY exists. So that's not true. So, there are so many proliferating possibilities for gender.
Right. And I think it boggles my mind how complicated some people feel like they have to make this, because to me it's as easy as this is the thing that happens most of the time. Some other things happen other times, and there shouldn't be a moral connotation to literally any of it. Like it really, in my mind, it really is that simple. Like when I say normal, I think the thing that happens 50% plus one of the time. And it means literally nothing other than that. But obviously society has different ideas. Ari, I want you to jump in because you've got good questions in here too.
Yes. So Callie mentioned that she is not an academic type, but I am. So I'm coming for the academic type questions. I come from a background in psychology. I got my bachelor's in psychology and I'm starting my master's in developmental psychology this fall. So I come at it from the kind of scientific angle. So I'm interested in what the methodology is for gender studies. And from what you've said so far, it seems like there isn't really one methodology. It seems like it comes from a lot of different angles. You've got a philosophy angle, a sociology angle, maybe even like a medical or biological angle, a psychology angle. Is there anything, any particular methodology that like your average gender studies paper would use, or is it a really multifaceted, diverse type of study?
I think one of the amazing things about it is that it connects with so many different kinds of ways of looking at the world. I don't think that you could easily determine what the best possible methodology of approach would be for gender study, the specific gender studies project, until you're actually right into the heart of it, and you're starting to think about, is this really a psychology question? Is this really a history question?
So maybe it just depends on the context. What exactly is the question that you're asking, and then what's the best methodology to get at answering that question? Is that kind of where?
Absolutely, yeah.
So do you work when you come to a certain question that you're wanting to explore, and you realize that for example, this certain question might fall under more of the sociology type of realm? Would you work with sociologists to help you master that kind of methodology and apply that to your research?
I think Christina will agree with me on this, because we seem to have fairly wide-reaching approaches to the work that we've done. But I think that you tend to determine your particular interest areas a lot. I'm particularly interested in where the borders and boundaries of bodies are, and that's taken me in a lot of different directions. I've done some media studies and communication stuff. I've done some performance theory stuff. But most gender theory folk have a lot of pre-existing training in things like sociology and psychology and in anthropology and cultural studies and history and whatever it is that their leanings are. I did education, and so I've done there's a lot of really interesting stuff on gender in education and how that operates. And that you sort of adapt as that goes, but you would generally specialize, and if there are people to work with, then absolutely. But sometimes you're just the best person to deal with that. Happen to know the best resources. And for instance, I found I started out with a elementary school teaching training, and when I started delving into gender and education, I realized that even though the two buildings on campus were literally 15 feet away from each other, the transmission of knowledge was about 15 years apart.
Right.
And it was fascinating because I could bring relatively basic existing gender studies knowledge to my education approaches, and instantly it would be fascinating new research.
Can you give an example of that? That sounds really interesting to me.
Well, so for instance, I did. I am particularly interested in roller derby, and I've done a bunch of stuff around sport and sport education and how that operates in the world. And there are some ideas around the way that gender is performed and gender operates that I've taken into sport and said, has anyone thought about this in terms of not binarizing gender? And 10 years ago when I was doing a bunch of this work, just exploring why we might not want to create artificial binaries between the ways that people play sport in schools was just an outrageously out there idea.
I was going to say, that sounds like heresy, damn it.
Right. And it was because, all these things, the physical anything becomes completely binarized for no clear reason. People are very muddy about it, and they get very defensive because they know they're very muddy about it. And so when you can ask these very simple questions, and particular kinds of frameworks become very, very confused and upset, and have to do some real soul searching to work out how to reply, how to do the next thing.
This may take us slightly off topic, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why that might be. Like, in my mind, I think it's just because humans sort of have a tendency to want things to be simple, and sometimes we get annoyed when they're not. Maybe that's overly simplistic. I don't know.
I think, there's this thing that happens when we're young. It's called the mirror phase, and it was theorized first by Lacan. So Ari may be familiar with that. But basically, it's this idea that you recognize that you are an individual, and that there's things that are others, right? Things that are kind of outside of yourself. And I think what happens is, since, Callie, you kind of pointed to this earlier, right, is that the normal is the 50 plus the 1%, right? So those people are able to, if they are one of these normalized bodies, they're able to look at themselves on one end of this binary or the other, and then see the what they would consider, although I'm sure we all would probably kind of argue this, what they would consider, or what we're taught socially, is the opposite gender, and to be able to see that as the other, or anything that isn't their end as the other.
And so I guess that's a thing. People become comfortable in that, and that being challenged, I think, makes people uncomfortable. I think does that sound right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really does make people very uncomfortable about gender studies is that ambiguity and ambivalence is really something they've embraced. Things are really hard. Things are really complicated. There are a whole ton of different places on the gray spectrum in between black and white, and the kind of binary logics that we've been forced into since Descartes started talking about it, just don't serve us very well, to be honest. We're losing out all kinds of things. For instance, I mean, if you're thinking about gender studies in terms of history, the amazing movie Hidden Figures that came out recently and told us all about these incredible black women who were taking on NASA and taking on the world and doing incredible things in the world. It would have been feminists, it would have been people with a gender studies background who would have done the research and found out about these really important pieces of our history. And the difficulty is that when you're not looking for these extra pieces of that, you lose so much in the arc of history when we're talking about things. You start thinking that maybe, in fact, what the arc of history of this era is just about, the handful of men in power. And it's not true.
And that's another beautiful thing about gender studies, is that intersectionality is at its core. And I think I don't know if you would agree, Genevieve, but in almost every feminist will incorporate intersectionality in their studies and in their research now. Mm-hmm. And that just gives us the ability to look at identities as they are, which means that these weren't just women, these were black women. And so what does that mean? And how does that change their life and the story and the narrative that they want to tell? And then how do we share that story?
It's time once again to help us crowdfund the gay agenda. As you may have heard, certain segments of the internet were not happy when they found out that two of the main characters in the new show Star Trek Discovery were women of color, instead of the white cishet men we all know are totally representative of what most people in the galaxy actually look like. There were cries of white genocide and misandry and the liberal agenda ruining our beloved Star Trek. What a lot of these fucking ridiculous crybabies may not know is that one of the white guys in the cast is gay. To prepare for this revelation to hit the internet, we're using the money from our patrons this week to buy tissues to collect all of the delicious white cishet male tears that will be shed once it's widely realized that the liberal agenda has taken yet another slice of equality and representation away from the people in our society who most desperately need and deserve it. So Mike, Chad, Riss and Ari, thank you so much for helping us collect those delicious tears so that our gayness may be nourished. Hail Satan. To find out more, head over to patreon.com/thegaytheist manifesto and consider a per episode donation to help support the show and our subversion of the goodness and wholesomeness of white Christian America. Thanks, friends. Yeah, I feel like I look at statistics, right? And I think to myself, okay, if you're just run down the list, right? Like if you're a woman, if you're trans, if you're disabled, if you're queer of any flavor, if you're born into poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, just looking at the hard science, right? All of those things make you significantly statistically more likely to experience pretty much everything bad in life. Uh-huh. Part of me feels like it's absurd that we need to have these big, heady philosophical discussions, because for me, that information is right there in black and white, right? So, like, are we really gonna say, for example, that the fact that the poverty rate in the black community is like many times the poverty rate of white people? Like, are we gonna really pretend that that's random, that that those things are not connected given the history of our country? Or the fact that healthcare for women or people who have bodies that were assigned female at birth, like that healthcare is more expensive and more complicated and more policed in our culture. Like, are we going to pretend that that's just a random occurrence? Like, those things aren't connected? Mm-hmm. And
yes, we are.
Right. And
well,
go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say that's just why you need these gender studies voices. Because I am, like we mentioned, I'm in law school. There's a dual degree at the University of Cincinnati where you get your master's in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and you have to get accepted to that program. And then you also have to get accepted into the law school. And then you do both of these programs, and in 4 years, you come out with both. I've got the master's portion done, but I'm still in the law school portion. Law school is nothing like women, gender, and sexuality studies. It's a completely different way of thinking. The people are completely different. You kind of get spoiled when you're sitting in a room full of other people that are like-minded to you. And I'm sure Genevieve can say that too in her research, is when you get you're in a class with other students, and the people that take most of these classes, to be honest with you, are the people that don't necessarily need to, that are already looking at these things that you're bringing up, Callie, and saying, yeah, that's true. Well, I'm not going to deny that. And they're there for that reason. But I can say I've actually had this issue before. Is I heard from someone that people were complaining because in classes I always brought up gender or sexuality or, I would point out that, hey, you guys are talking about gender in very binary terms and, these kind of things. And my teachers, most of the professors actually appreciate that, right? Because they're being challenged as well. But a lot of the students do not appreciate that. And they say, why does Christina always talk about that? But on the other hand, I have had more than that. I've had twice as many people come up to me and say, don't change. I changed the way I thought because you said that. I had never considered that before. I had never considered about how the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, might affect transgender individuals. And so these are things that are real life issues. And I think that's one of the things I, wanted to definitely point out too, is that by looking at this degree that they're offering, you can see that they're definitely seeing an application very practically to the law and gender. And, and I see that overlapping all the time. And, particularly, of course, when we look at equal pay, but my thing lately has been when we look at these like bathroom bills, right? What can we do to change the way that people think? And what can we do about that?
I'm glad you brought that up, because the thing that brought up this whole topic for us was, of course, the infamous Conceptual Penis hoax paper. And if you're familiar with that, if you've read excerpts of it, it's just the most heady, philosophical, like, that's what they think gender studies is, like just kind of word salad spewed out onto the page. And I find it really comforting that may be the stereotype of gender studies, but that there's actually, you know, practical applications that can actually help people in the real world.
Mm-hmm. I think it's actually fascinating to look at that itself, because I feel like in so many cases, what the trolls say actually reveals far more about the trolls themselves and what they believe about the world than it does about the actual thing they think they're attacking. So it seems to me that we can look at that and think, well, isn't this a sad world that you live in, where you feel like you have no access to conversations about gender and sexuality, where you feel like any kind of disagreement or debate is a personal attack on you, when you feel like you have to disprove the very like foundation of somebody's thought process in order to get past the fact that they may not actually agree with you on something, or you may have got something wrong, in fact.
I was just thinking, I mean these guys are, I mean, I don't know James Lindsay very well, but I mean, Peter Boghossian is an academic. That's like, I mean, his living is he's a college professor, right? So
yeah,
I mean,
he's a philosophy professor.
Yeah, I mean, if he had...
Philosophy is notorious for being basically a sausage fest.
Right.
Very true.
I once presented at a political philosophy conference that was called New Directions in Political Philosophy, and I guess I was a new direction because I was the token feminist queer person in the entire room / conference, and my
Did you
God,
have a sticker?
I should have, because everyone just started rolling their eyes when I stuck my hand up, and I just couldn't stop. It was so many things were so egregious. They were like, let us debate the philosophy taking bodies and race and all actualities out of the equation. And I was like, sorry, how can we have a discussion about female genital mutilation without engaging with race and bodies?
And I feel like what that attempts to do is to make philosophy into the straw man people make it out to be, right? Because when people talk about philosophy and, you know, when people say like, oh, I'm getting a philosophy degree, right? The sort of dismissive reaction is that, well, that's not applicable to the real world. That has no practical application. It doesn't really matter in the real world.
Have fun working at McDonald's.
Right. And of course, there are plenty of people in philosophy who would disagree with that assessment. But I feel like what they were trying to do was make philosophy into that, where they're taking it so far out of the context that we all exist in that they were making it worthless to reality.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that I guess gender studies is a sort of difficult reminder for so many people who would like to be divorced from their bodies and sort of just exist in the academic sphere. And I think so many people find that very comforting space, especially if, you know, they are experiencing any form of like growing older or having to actually realize that, you know, women aren't interested in sitting back these days and not having their voices acknowledged, that, you know, transness is something that perhaps being a philosophy professor doesn't give you a lot of knowledge of. And in fact, that's a very glaring oversight in today's world. And you kind of have to catch up. I think making the straw person gender studies is not a solid reflection on the trolls to anything except that they're clearly not interested in engaging with how the world operates and how we're doing things in the real world.
Yeah, and there's no better illustration of that than, you know, every time Boghossian's been challenged, he's just been not interested. Like he's the kind of person who will cry about safe spaces and all of that when he won't debate anyone or go engage on any platform aside from his own Twitter account or his own classroom. And that's just so funny to me. And then James Lindsay tweeted like, well, if you don't like our paper, go find good ones, bring them to me and show me. And it's like, shifting the goalpost, guy. Like, are you really presenting yourself as a skeptic? Like, come on.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the best ways to make yourself irrelevant is to refuse to engage with anyone that thinks differently, and is, you know, pushing the boundaries of knowledge, is introducing things that are uncomfortable. It's all very well to, and this is one of the interesting things, because so many people who are in less, well, I guess the marked position, right? So the other side of the binary, the not white, the not normative, the you know, the gendered as opposed to the unmarked male. As long as you're in the other section of the binary, you are the one that is constantly expected to explain yourself. And so if you happen to be on the side that does not get marked, then having to explain whiteness is very confronting. And one way to make yourself incredibly irrelevant is to just refuse to look at it.
Right.
Refuse to acknowledge. Yeah.
And what you're getting at there is the idea that that there are certain groups of people who have the luxury of thinking of themselves as the default, right? When you say the unmarked, right? A white person doesn't think of themselves as white; they just think of themselves as a person. But a person of color has to think of themselves in the context of where they fall on that spectrum, or a trans person has to think about that, about their gender. Whereas generally speaking, you know, the default, you know, white cis straight hetero guy is not compelled to reflect on that, at least nowhere near as strongly as the other is. And I think that's a really important thing to point out.
Well, Callie, I'm going to push back a little bit on you, because I'm pretty sure that being a straight white male is the only group that you're allowed to be bigoted against these days. Like, what's up with that? Like, this whole paper sent out to prove that gender studies is out to get men, and they'll publish anything that has an anti-male bias, and they were right. It happened.
Yeah. You can pay any pay to play publisher to publish. It's ridiculous. And so I want to go back to something that you said a few minutes ago, Genevieve, because you were talking about the idea that people are uncomfortable being challenged, right? And I think that is another stereotype of the, I guess we're calling them the gender studies folks, like the people who are generally in favor of this being a thing,
gender
right?
Studiesers, gender students. I don't know what the heck you call these.
There's the stereotype that we all sort of live in this echo chamber, right? And that we never want to engage with anyone who disagrees with us, and that we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us. And I think, you know, to a certain degree, obviously everyone does that, especially in certain social circles. But I think that's probably something else to spend a little more time talking about, because I know in like some of the activist groups that I'm in on Facebook, some of the more radical activist groups, I mean, that's just not the case. Like, there are a few basic tenets that most people agree on, but there is lively discussion and back and forth on a lot of different things. And I mean, that's just generally not the way that things work. Can either you, Genevieve, or Christina, if you have anything to say about that, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
I think one of the really important things to remember is that, you know, I might be involved in thinking about the world through a gender studies angle for many, many things that I do, but I also exist in the world as a human being. I also exist as a femme and as a woman and as a queer woman. And so I have opinions thrust upon me all day, every day, all the time. People come out and inform me the best way to do my life again and again and again, all the time, because of the ways that I present in the world. People have commentary on my appearance, on the way that I'm doing anything, number of things. That's how I exist. I know what norms look like. I know what pre-existing history looks like, because we've been taught all of that. We've been told what the right way to do these things is, that what the default of everything is. We've been told it all our life. We're constantly indoctrinated by it. So we don't really need to hear about it more. What we're interested in is the things that are different from that, the ways that we can explore the world and like construct them and reconstruct them so they make better sense, so they don't directly damage the lives and the futures of people because there are some pretty stark realities, which is things like, being a white woman in America means that your life expectancy is in the 70s and 80s. Being a trans woman of color, your life expectancy is about 35. And that's a really, really stark difference. That's worth having a conversation about. That's why people's intersections are so important, because they really vividly affect people's lives.
Christina, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can give you guys a very practical example of this. I kind of brought it up earlier. There was a lawsuit filed by a trans woman who was saying that she was not receiving equal protection from the American with Disability Act because it is written in there that transvestitism, along with things that, of course, they always put it with homosexuality and pedophilia, right? Because that's how...
because those are all the same thing, as we all know.
Right, exactly. Politicians, right? So This was a bill drafted, and that was explicitly put in as an exception, so that you could not receive coverage by the Americans with Disability Act, which helps with discrimination and with doctors and jobs and public accommodations and all kinds of things. And so the conversation kind of became, the Department of Justice didn't really want to answer that question. They never want to talk about constitutionality, so they always try to approach it a different way. And what they decided was that gender dysphoria, as classified by a doctor, was not, it did incorporate something with your body, right? So because of how your body was affected, they were actually going to allow that to be covered. It was settled out of court because, again, they don't want to deal with it. But the reason I bring this up is because that brings up a very interesting question, doesn't it, Callie? Like, for example, if a person doesn't want to classify themselves with this medical diagnosis for life, they cannot access the law, right? Mm-hmm. A person who is trans any other way other than being labeled with this medical diagnosis. So this conversation comes up, and a lot of trans identified people would say, I don't want to be labeled as having a disability anyway. This is not a disability. But then on the other hand, from a practical approach, this would solve a lot of problems as far as allowing access to restrooms and providing medical care for those that are seeking medical intervention, right, in a transition. So these are questions that come up, and do you really want politicians to be making these decisions without other experts, without gender experts in the mix and in the conversation? Because these are things that are actually going to the court, going in front of judges, are being argued by attorneys. And without a voice that has some kind of knowledge, or at least the ability to bring in that knowledge, right, from other experts, like we talked about from psychology or sociology, I mean, we would just have these white heterosexual men, cis men, making the laws that are affecting so many other people
whose experiences they couldn't possibly understand. And
absolutely,
yeah, and I think that, I mean, because I have a very personal experience with that. When I first started going to a doctor to get hormones, because I didn't have insurance, but there's a primary care doctor who I could afford his office visits, thankfully, and I started paying for hormones out of pocket. And he told me at my visit, he was like, I'm coding your diagnosis as unspecified hormone disorder. And I was like, or unspecified endocrine disorder. And I was like, why would you do that? And he's like, because insurance companies can still deny you coverage for being trans. So I'm not going to let the insurance company know you're trans, but I can still prescribe your hormones to you.
Yep,
and I was
that happened to me as well when I got hormones from Howard Brown. And
this was very, very early on in my journey, and I was very, very new to the politics and the culture and all this. I mean, so I knew vaguely that medical stuff was difficult for trans people, but I didn't know any of these nuances, and I was just like, wow, like that's a thing that really has to happen, like really?
And thank God those doctors knew anything about gender to know to actually kind of get around these rules that are there to harm the bodies of trans individuals.
Right, exactly. And so now, because I didn't have insurance at the time, but now that I do, I don't sort of have that, I guess, black mark on my medical history, right? So that's not going to follow me around. And of course, I'm having surgery that my insurance is paying for in July, so I'm sure that will, then follow me therein because, I figure the insurance company will need some kind of diagnosis on the record to get that. But I was just, in the entire context of this, are we really going to say that gender is not a thing that we need to be taking a close look at? Like, it's absolutely senseless to me that people could think that.
Absolutely. And I think it's been going on for many, many years. I mean, if you're thinking about like the kind of ramifications of medical decisions, one of the things that, family planning enthusiasts in the 1920s discovered quite rapidly was that if you give women particularly access to reproductive health resources, the life expectancies of the people in the community, the poverty levels, everything transforms in the positive. People's entire life experiences transform to the positive. Deaths, mortalities around the community decrease dramatically. And the same goes with education. If you give education, particularly to the women in communities, the general education levels of the children that they're so often forced to, by societal expectations to be the caretakers of, increase dramatically. The community, the general well-being of the community improves dramatically. And it was definitely gender studies people that brought that knowledge to the world.
So we talked a little bit about we didn't get into too much detail because we're not going to waste time going over something that people far more educated in this have already gone over, but the Conceptual Penis paper, of course. So yeah, it didn't prove that gender studies is a bunk field entirely. But one way that people are praising it or admitting that it did have a point in some of its aims was that it called attention to some publishing practices that are a little bit sketchy. So they basically paid to have their paper published in a really low-quality journal with very limited peer review. So I was wondering if you could tell us what the publication process is usually like in gender studies and what the peer-reviewed standards are and how somebody could tell whether a journal was a high-quality or low-quality journal.
Well, Genevieve, I'll let you handle that one because I think you've had more experience with publishing.
My experience has involved double-blind reviewing, which is a pretty standard process for most academic journals of any kind of reputation.
And can you explain that for folks who may not be familiar?
So basically you submit a paper, your name is taken off it, and your work is given to two people who they generally try and make sure you're not likely to have coincided with too much. They'll hand your paper to those two people, and those people will review them with no knowledge of who the person that wrote it might be. And they'll submit their review comments, and then you're asked to either review and make changes to your work according to their comments, or your work is rejected. And it's very, very rare that somebody would have their work accepted without edits. And one of the interesting things is that there are a number of places where academic journals are ranked in different ways. But in fact, there are, by reputation, some journals have great reputations, but are also very interested in keeping those reputations up by running with people with big names in the community, like, for instance, the academics that wrote that paper, who themselves have pre-existing reputations. And so there are a handful of journals that keep up their reputations by publishing the work of people who already have pre-existing and often canonical kind of works out in the community. But in fact, despite many people's thoughts to the contrary, often the publications that publish early career researchers and PhD students and, you know, anyone doing earlier research are actually often the most grueling to be published in, because, you know, your work is relatively unvetted. You don't necessarily have a pre-existing reputation. And so, you know, there are a bunch of different journals that will operate in those different kinds of ways. And this varies to some degree, as we were talking about, like, you know, the different, if we're talking about sociology, there's frequently a range of different publications that have a reputation that operate in different ways to this. Medical journals, you know, require certain vetting for scientific research, all that kind of thing. Gender studies is so broad. It's very hard to sort of point in one direction and say that is the place where gender studies research is coming from.
Something that I feel like I need to point out is that there were several other questions that I had written down in our run sheet here that I actually didn't end up needing to ask. Things like, why should people outside of academia care about gender studies, right? Because there's this idea that, like we were talking about earlier, like a philosophy degree, a lot of people sort of look down on that and say that it's, you know, it's useless in a practical sense. It doesn't have any application to the real world. And I wanted to sort of talk about some of the practical good that this field of study has done. And so initially, when I asked, you know, what is gender studies, we didn't seem to be able to talk about what it is without discussing those questions. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a very poignant reminder of the relevance and importance of the field.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I'd agree with you on that one.
Well, friends, this has been an awesome conversation. I was thoroughly fascinated listening to you talk, because this is a lot of this stuff is new to me. Like I said, I guess I'm a hobbyist academic. Like, this stuff is all really interesting to me, but I've never gone to college or anything. I feel like I need to. But
and I have, and I still didn't know anything about gender studies.
Well, there you go.
I have my master's, and I barely know anything about gender studies. So, I mean, that's because it's such a broad foeld, which is so awesome.
Well, yeah.
And the more you know, you don't know. So.
Exactly. you change your mind 1,000 times, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's life, right? I think that's an admirable way to be in any place in life. So again, Christina and Genevieve, thank you both so much for taking the time to teach us this stuff. I think this is all really important stuff, and I am really, really excited that we got to have this conversation.
Thank you.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Again, cannot thank Genevieve and Christina enough for their time and for spending time to educate us with all of that great stuff. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. And I bet Ari's got a thing.
Callie, I want to tell you a story about my childhood.
Oh, God.
When I was a child, I loved to play with earthworms after a summer thunderstorm. I would wait inside until the storm had passed, go out into the muggy southeast Texas humidity, and find my favorite patch of rocks in the yard. Then I'd turn over each stone, looking carefully for the fleshy worms burrowing in the mud. When I found them, I'd pick them out of the ground, clean off the mud, and watch them wiggle in my hand. You know, I was going to try to turn this into some kind of parable about how we should all go out into the world and turn over the stones of the way things seem to be and look for the truth underneath buried in the mud, but that seems like kind of a stretch, so I think I'll leave you this week with this bit of wisdom instead. Worms are pretty cool and fun to play with. If you agree, you should friend me on Facebook, email me at aristillman4@gmail.com, or catch me on my other podcast, The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand, or my super secret podcast, The SJW Circle Jerk, which I coincidentally do keep buried in the mud under the stones in the yard in the hopes that no one will find it. And if you don't agree, then you clearly hate childhood magic, and I'm not sure I want that kind of negativity in my life.
Fair enough. That was a great story, Ari. I feel like I know you better, and we're closer now for that. That's good.
Worms.
If you want to support the show, you can...
Worms.
They're not finished.
Callie, do the outro. I'm going to keep singing about worms. Worms, worms, worms.
I'm going to hang up on you.
No!
If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto, make a per episode donation to help the show out. And if that's not doable, you can always head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review, and that helps us get heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gay Theist Manifesto.